The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Let us pray. Holy God, who desires us to prosper and experience health, give our nation such a harvest of righteousness that our land will be filled with peace, quietness, and unity. Use our lawmakers to enable our citizens to live in safety, confidence, and peace. As our senators seek to serve you and country, give them the wisdom and courage to bring harmony from discord. Lord, be merciful to them as they wait with eager expectancy for your guidance. May they honor the promises they make, living lives that reflect the integrity of your kingdom. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask for 1 minute for morning business.
Without objection.
The Tuesday after Thanksgiving has been known as Giving Tuesday. And I suppose this Giving Tuesday is receiving more attention than usual because of the virus pandemic that we've been in for the last 12 months. Like many sectors, the nonprofit industry is hurting because of COVID-19. As part of the CARES Act passed last March, Congress enacted key provisions encouraging charitable giving to help support organizations that are being called upon more than ever to help Americans because of the virus pandemic. These charitable giving provisions that are in the CARES Act apply both to individuals who itemize their taxes and those who do not itemize. Iowa is blessed to have an extensive network of charitable organizations who are supported by incredible volunteers who open up their pocketbooks to support their neighbors in need. This fall, Senator Ernst and I heard from at least 20 nonprofits in the Cedar Rapids area about their challenges that they face because of the pandemic and natural disasters. And also we heard from the successes they've had this year. The work that Iowa nonprofits do is inspiring and has tremendous impact. In this season of Thanksgiving, I speak on behalf of my home state to thank these organizations, their employees and volunteers for the hard work and services that they deliver every day of the year to Iowans in need. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, anyone who's heard me speak about coronavirus relief going back months has heard one central principle. Let's deliver right away on all the subjects where everybody agrees and argue over the rest later. The solution to this impasse has been in plain sight for a long time now for anybody willing to see it. Agree where we agree, bank that progress, make law, take a whole lot of pressure off struggling people, and then keep debating the areas where we don't agree. There's no actual reason why the fates of common sense policies, like a second round of the job-saving Paycheck Protection Program, had to be linked to the fates of fringe proposals like stimulus checks for illegal immigrants. There's no reason why the fate of funding for vaccine distribution or extending unemployment aid or legal certainty for universities should have been tied to radical ideas like paying people more not to work than essential workers earn on the job. These linkages have been totally arbitrary, just a political decision that Democratic leaders made many months back. Democratic leaders have tried to create a narrative where it's taken for granted that the most bipartisan, commonsensical relief policies would live or die with their side's most outlandish ideas. Well, that just isn't so. They've tried to create a dynamic where they move from one made-up number to a second, slightly smaller arbitrary number and call it a meaningful concession. The truth is simple. This has always been about policy differences. We have two sides with two different visions for the best way to support our nation through what we hope will be the last chapter of the pandemic. Now, that isn't new. We have disagreements all the time. Our system can handle disagreements, but both sides have to be willing to compile their commonalities and make law here. And up to now, our Democratic colleagues have declined to do that. Remember, their side said in March, this pandemic was, quote, a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. So when Republicans tried to pass common sense relief measures in July and in September, and in October as well, our Democratic colleagues actually blocked policies they do not even oppose. Now it's been heartening to see a few hopeful signs in the past few days. After months of arbitrary attachment to sky-high dollar amounts that the Speaker of the House claimed were essential, that it would be an insult to settle for a nickel less, those baseless claims have suddenly evaporated. That is at least movement in the right direction. But the underlying reality, Mr. President, is still with us. There are many important policies that have strong bipartisan support. There are many others that do not. And the way to help the country is for our Democratic colleagues to finally let the former group be signed into law while we keep arguing over the rest. The targeted second round of paycheck protection that we've been trying to establish since July would help a huge number of small businesses survive to the finish line and help huge numbers of workers keep their jobs. And it could pass the Senate today probably with 95 votes. With the apparent success of Operation Warp Speed, it makes no sense to skimp on the systems to distribute and deliver vaccines around the country. Those funds could pass the Senate today, possibly unanimously. University presidents have made it clear they need legal certainty for their reopenings. Let me say that again. University presidents have made it clear they need legal certainty for their reopenings. That shouldn't be partisan. Liability protection should be able to pass the Senate today. A number of our Democratic colleagues have focused especially on several of the unemployment relief programs that are set to expire in a matter of days. I specifically made sure to include those programs in my framework a few days ago. That extension could pass the Senate today. The House of Representatives is spending this week on pressing issues like marijuana. Marijuana. You know, serious and important legislation benefiting the national crisis. But here in the Senate, I put forward a serious and highly targeted relief proposal, including the elements which we know the President is ready and willing to sign into law. Why should these impactful and non-controversial life preservers be delayed 1 second longer? At long last, let's do what Congress does when we want an outcome. Let's make law on all the subjects where we agree, on all the areas where President Trump is ready to sign bipartisan relief into law. I promise our deep differences will still be here to debate. Our disagreements will be right where we left them. But you know what can't wait? What can't wait? American workers, American small businesses, K through 12 schools, the vulnerable Americans and frontline healthcare workers for whom speedy vaccine distribution will literally be a life or death matter. Yesterday, my home state of Kentucky experienced yet another dreadful record-setting day. But Kentuckians also know that hope is in sight. Our state's workers are standing by at the UPS Worldport in Louisville and the DHL Express American Hub in northern Kentucky, key logistics centers that will play crucial roles in sending vaccines all around the country. Our people are hurting, but they're ready to finish this fight. Congress should not keep them waiting for reinforcements that should have arrived literally months ago. So compromise is within reach. We know where we agree. We can do this. Let me say it again, we can do this. And we need to do this. So let's be about actually making a law.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Federal Reserve System, Christopher Waller of Minnesota to be a member of the Board of Governors.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from South Dakota.
President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
It is,
I would ask a unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
without objection.
Mr. President, I was pleased that the Senate unanimously agreed yesterday to proceed to conference on the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA is one of the most important pieces of legislation that we pass here every year. It's the bill that authorizes funding for our troops and lays out our defense priorities. Like the last two NDAAs, this year's bill focuses on restoring military readiness and ensuring that our nation is prepared to meet threats posed by major powers like Russia and China. In November of 2018, the Bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission released a report warning that our readiness had eroded to the point that we might struggle to win a war against a major power like Russia or China. And the Commission noted that we would be especially vulnerable if we were ever called on to fight a war on two fronts. Over the past 2 years, we've made real progress on restoring military readiness, but we still have more work to do. And this year's National Defense Authorization Act continues our investment in ensuring that our military is prepared to meet current and future threats in any domain. Of course, no matter what weapons or tanks or planes we have, our greatest military resource will always be our men and women in uniform. And this year's NDAA invests in improving the quality of life for our military members and their families. The bill supports a 3% pay raise for our troops, and it builds on previous measures to improve military health care and housing. It will also provide support for military families in areas like child care and professional development for military spouses. Mr. President, as I said, this bill is one of the most important measures that we pass every year, and we need to make sure that we pass the final version of this legislation before Christmas. Failing to pass this legislation would send the wrong message to our troops and our allies and to our adversaries. While this may not be a perfect bill, it contains a lot of important provisions to rebuild our military and give our men and women in uniform the tools that they need to defend our nation. We need to pass it as soon as possible. Mr. President, yesterday afternoon, Mike Enzi delivered his farewell address, and while Mike has more than earned his retirement over a long and dedicated career in Washington and in Wyoming, we're going to miss him here in the United States Senate. Mike is an accountant and spent years as a small businessman, and he brought that background and common sense to Washington, D.C. with him. In many ways, he's been the conscience of the Senate on spending issues, reminding us that we don't have an unlimited amount of money to spend and that every dollar we add to the debt is a burden that will have to be met by our children and grandchildren. As chairman of the Budget Committee, he has passed budgets with an eye to restraining spending and lessening the burden that we place on future generations. His 2018 budget also paved the way for the landmark Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which reformed America's outdated tax code, helped create jobs and opportunities for workers, and put more money in the pockets of American families. Mike is an outstanding legislator, and he's also one of the finest human beings that you will ever meet. I think all of us have benefited from his thoughtfulness at one time or another. I remember when I was experiencing heel pain a few years ago with an ailment called plantar fasciitis, and I mentioned it to Mike because he was a shoe salesman and a shoe store owner. Well, it wasn't more than a few days later where Mike comes to me with some heel inserts to put into my shoes, which I might add helped a lot. Obviously, he had a lot of experience through the years dealing with people with foot issues. But it was typical of Mike Enzi, thoughtful and practical, down to earth. In business, as everyone knows, the customer comes first, and Mike has brought that attitude to his 24 years here in the United States Senate. As a shoe salesman, he put his customers first, and as a senator, he always put his constituents and the American people first. He's never forgotten how to help people. He's never forgotten where he comes from, and he has worked hard every day that he's been here in the United States Senate to make life better for the people of Wyoming and for the American citizens. He's an outstanding colleague and a friend, and I will miss his wisdom and expertise and his great fishing stories. Mike, I wish you the very best of everything in your retirement. I'm glad you'll have more time to spend with Diana and the kids and grandkids and more time to enjoy your beloved state, home state of Wyoming. While no state will ever compare to South Dakota in my book, I've got to say that Wyoming is spectacularly beautiful, and I'm glad you'll be able to be there now on more of a full-time basis. But you will be missed here, and I want to thank you for your service and your friendship. May God bless you and your family in your retirement. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you. I rise today to talk a little bit about what's happening in Nevada. You know, last week I had the opportunity to be home, and I went to one of our mobile food banks in East Las Vegas just before Thanksgiving. The mobile food bank is one of our food pantries throughout the state of Nevada, and this one particular one is run by 3 Square. And I arrived around 8 a.m. in the morning to a line of cars waiting at the site. And that line sometimes gets so long, police have to direct traffic around it. Literally, they lined up at 3 a.m. Now, the food pantry doesn't even open until 7 or 8 in the morning, but they were there at 3 a.m. around the block in their cars to stay safe from the COVID-19 pandemic. But there were over 350 of them throughout that morning. And that is not unusual with what's happening in Nevada right now. That is not unusual, and it should be. But because this pandemic has hit Nevada and so many states so hard, we are seeing the consequences of inaction by this body in the Senate. You know, as I got there that morning, I imagine these people in the middle of the night with their lights and power off in their cars to save fuel in the cold desert night. And they waited patiently. They were quiet because they knew assistance would be there when morning comes. And sometimes that food runs out for those many people that are waiting, and then they have to come the next day. But because of the inaction in this chamber, most Nevadans who are hurting don't have that reassurance that there will be immediate, swift relief for them, because they don't know when federal help will come. And lifeline organizations like 3 Square, which are working tirelessly to help families fill the gaps, are running out of resources. It's been 223 days since the Senate last approved funds to help all Americans endure this once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe. And meanwhile, too many people in Nevada are languishing in the dark, hoping for economic assistance that still hasn't arrived. In Nevada, we continue to have the second highest unemployment rate in the country at 12%. That's almost twice the national rate. Unemployment is so high in Nevada because of the coronavirus pandemic. It has stopped conventions, our entertainment, hospitality, and travel operations in the Silver State and across the country. In August, in Nevada, employment in travel and tourism was down 25% over last year. Now, nationwide, spending on travel has declined by 42% compared to 2019. As a result, there are 60% fewer travelers to McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas, and 50% fewer travelers to Las Vegas itself. The American Hotel and Lodging Association estimates that without more funding, nearly 70% of hotels may close by the end of this year. Because of the devastation, what has been driving a thriving hospitality industry in Nevada, many of the jobs aren't there right now, and too many workers in Nevada can't pay their bills. More than 175,000 people in the Silver State continue to claim unemployment insurance. People without jobs are struggling right now to pay rent or mortgages or health care. Let me just tell you, housing assistance from the CARES Act helped tens of thousands of Nevadans and millions of Americans keep a roof over their heads. And that was legislation we passed immediately in a bipartisan way, one of 4. But those funds have run out. They're gone, and they need to be replaced. When the limited CDC eviction moratorium expires on January 1st, Nevada is bracing for 250,000 to 400,000 possible evictions. That's more than 20 times the national number of evictions in 2019. Families and seniors can't get enough to eat. In August and September, 234,000 Nevadans said their households were experiencing food insecurity. That's 11% of Nevada households going hungry, the second largest share in the country. 129,000 said that the children in their homes didn't have enough food. The longer we delay passing additional economic relief, the more jeopardy we create for our entire economy nationwide. And don't take my word for it, just listen to Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve, who has been saying this over and over again, most recently in the Banking Committee hearing that I'm a member of. The Senate must do more to help people, not just in my home state, but across the country, especially now as case counts are climbing. We're only months away from being able to give the population at large immunity to this deadly virus. We have to do everything we can to help people get to that time, to ensure that for coming months, Nevadans can stay in their homes, they can take care of kids, they can keep their businesses running, knowing that they will have an opportunity to open them in the future, and they can protect themselves from this virus. The only way to do that is to get them the relief they need now. That relief simply has to include more money for state, local, and tribal governments, which have had to cut back on critical services in the middle of a pandemic. It should include extended unemployment benefits and pandemic unemployment assistance, as well as more loans for our small businesses and for PPP. It must have housing assistance to prevent a wave of homelessness and illness, and it should do more to protect workers, fund education, and stave off hunger for families. It also needs to include billions that states have asked for to help with vaccine distribution. We are going to be rolling out millions of doses of vaccines, all of which will need to be stored, handled, and tracked across 50 states. Healthcare workers, not just in Nevada, but across the country, will need training to administer the vaccine, and the public needs education about vaccine safety and access. We've witnessed an amazing feat of human ingenuity in developing a vaccine faster than we've ever done it before. But the federal government and this chamber still hasn't set money aside to make sure that vaccines get to those who need it. And it's also has to include money for testing and tracing so that we can contain the spread of this virus and get more people back to work. Mr. President, nobody should be standing in the way of a comprehensive bipartisan relief package to help Americans hold out until they can get the vaccines that we know are coming. They need relief now. And that's why I support the bipartisan proposal that our colleagues in the Senate put together just recently. In that proposal, which they look at in a comprehensive way for all of our states, it includes money for state and local tribal governments. It includes additional unemployment insurance. It supports funding for small businesses, including Paycheck Protection Program, idle disaster loans, restaurants, stages, and deductibility. What I mean by stages are the live events in the hospitality industry that have been so devastated and have not received any relief during the time that we have appropriated funds to address the pandemic. It includes CDFI and community lender support. It includes transportation for our airlines, our airports, our buses, our transit and Amtrak, and our workers there. It includes vaccine development and distribution and testing and tracing. It includes money for healthcare provider relief. It includes money for education, for student loans, and yes, housing assistance and rental assistance that is needed now. It also includes money for nutrition, for the food insecurity that I just talked about, that I witnessed that morning in Las Vegas, and that we hear about constantly, not just in Nevada, but across this country. It includes money for childcare, for broadband, for the U.S. Postal Service, so many things. And it was well-reasoned and compromised and thought out, and it was our colleagues coming together, Republicans and Democrats, coming together for the best interests of this country. Now, Mr. President, I will tell you, we do not need unanimous support for this proposal. What we need is a vote on the floor of the Senate. And that's why I'm asking Mitch McConnell to allow this proposal to come to the floor of the Senate for a vote. If some of my colleagues don't want to support any more relief, then they don't have to vote for it. But I would guarantee, and I would suspect, that there are more than enough of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that want to pass relief for the many Americans across this country in our states who are suffering right now. But they have to be given the opportunity. Now, I get that right now there's only one person that gets to decide what goes on the floor of the Senate. Now, I don't agree with that. That's the way the rules are set. And Mitch McConnell decides every single day what legislation comes to the floor of the Senate, what can be debated, what amendments can come. And I've watched these 4 years as Mitch McConnell, instead of including the Democrats in bipartisan negotiation on some of these important bills, he puts them together in closed doors with only Republicans and maybe the current administration, and then puts them on the floor of the Senate for the first time, bypasses our committee hearings where there's bipartisan support, usually for bills, bypasses that, puts it on the floor of the Senate without any compromise, without any of the Democrats' involvement, and expects us to vote for it, and then holds the Democrats accountable. Accountable. Because we didn't have the opportunity to fight for our states and put important funding in there for state and local government, for broadband, for our healthcare workers, for our hospitality industry, for you name it. And that's not the way the Senate should be operating, Mr. President. You know that, and I know that. We have to get back to a time when we compromise, when we all come representing our states. We all have equal votes. There's 2 of us from each state. We are fighting for our constituents in our states, and we should be able to have that debate, that conversation on the floor of the Senate in a fair manner. And that's why I asked Mitch McConnell to allow a vote on this proposal. You know, I had the opportunity to watch one of my colleagues talk about this, and I absolutely agree with him, Senator Angus King. He said, you know, I sit in these committees, in a bipartisan committees, and I vote for relief for disasters, hurricane disasters, fire in the western states that I come from, where you know so well that the fires are devastating our western states. But for the hurricanes that happened in Texas, Florida, you name it, I vote for relief because I know those constituents in those states are suffering. I don't look at them as blue states or red states. I look at them as Americans who are in need right now, and I'm going to support that relief. So why are we doing that with this coronavirus relief package? I do not understand. It's not what the American people expect of us. It's not what they want, and it's not what they deserve. So, Mr. President, I cannot stress this enough. It is time for the Senate to get back to work on behalf of the American public. And that means that we are willing to compromise. That means we are willing to do what is right and what is needed in our communities, because I can guarantee you, any one of us that go home to our state, we're all suffering. We all see it. And that's what the American people expect of us. So I'd hope Mitch McConnell allows a vote on the floor for this bipartisan compromise that the senators have worked on. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first, let me thank my colleague and friend, the senior senator from the great state of Nevada, for her words. They're on point. I hope the Republican leader was listening. I hope my Republican colleagues were listening, because her genuine concern for her state, which is suffering just like mine is, we're both states that depend on entertainment and tourism, is real. And we all want to get something done, and we're all willing to give to get something done. But the Republican leader holds the key, and we hope he's open to compromise. I'll have more to say that in a minute, but I thank her for her comments. And we all know how desperate things are. Yesterday, we were leveled by some of the grimmest statistics of the pandemic. More than 100,000 Americans were hospitalized. More than 2,700 Americans died, the highest recorded number in a single day since the pandemic began. More than 274,000 Americans have died in total. That's the equivalent of a 9/11 attack every day for 92 days in a row. Unlike the spring, when the rates of infections and fatalities peaked before steadily declining, the winter months and the hangover from Thanksgiving travel will likely cause these rates to get worse before they get better. The steady yet staggering loss of American life is horrific, and because so many of us are isolated, because so many have contracted the disease and have experienced relatively mild symptoms and recovered quickly, thank God, there's a sense that things are not as bad as they seem. But the raw accounting is unavoidable, and it is harrowing. The loss of our friends, our parents, our neighbors, our siblings, our colleagues must be acknowledged and mourned, and must inspire us to redouble our efforts to defeat this evil disease. As COVID-19 races through much of the country, the economic fallout of the pandemic also broadens. Many family budgets and small businesses are at their breaking point. Economists are now warning that the U.S. economy could fall into double-dip recession without additional relief from Congress. Let me say that again. We could have a double-dip recession unless there's relief, good, strong relief from Congress. And that's why Democrats have been so desperately trying to convince our Republican colleagues, and the Republican leader in particular, to work with us in a bipartisan fashion on another round of emergency federal relief. Speaker Pelosi and I made a new offer to Leader McConnell and Leader McCarthy on Monday in hopes of jump-starting serious negotiations. And Leader McConnell responded by circulating another version of a partisan, Republican-only draft. So in the spirit of compromise, Speaker Pelosi and I believe the bipartisan framework introduced by a group of 8 senators on Tuesday should be used as the basis, the framework, for immediate bipartisan, bicameral negotiations. Of course, we and others will offer improvements, but the need to act is urgent, and we believe that with good faith negotiations, we could very well come to an agreement. We are already much closer to an agreement because of the bipartisan talks these 8 senators have created, and we can build off their momentum. What's the alternative? Another round of legislative failure, a failure to help the American people? And the Republican leader came to the floor this morning to say compromise is within reach, his words, before reiterating a long list of Republican demands and blaming the Democrats for everything. Once again, the Republican leader argued that the Senate should pass only what Republicans approve of and leave the rest for later. And he now says that an emergency relief bill should be limited by only what President Trump will sign. Of course, we could say similarly, the bill should be limited only by what a Democratic House will pass. Neither is true compromise. The leader knows that. But for some reason, in the midst of this generational crisis, Republican leader McConnell does not seem inclined to compromise, to actually get something done. But what he wants to do is posture, to put partisan bills on the floor and say, take it or leave it. The real answer here is to sit down and talk. Let's use the bipartisan framework developed by 8 senators from both sides as our starting point. We have precious little time left before the end of the year. The country has some desperate needs. Unemployment remains too high. Laid-off workers need our assistance until the economy fully recovers. Small businesses need another round of support. With the imminent availability of a vaccine, it's crucial that there will be additional funding for manufacturing and distribution. The distribution efforts will be led by the states, which further increases the need to deliver assistance to state and local governments. As we all take great hope and solace in the idea that a vaccine is just around the corner, we must make necessary preparations to ensure that we have enough doses, that it's distributed effectively, efficiently, and fairly, and that Americans can access it affordably. We can make a significant down payment right now toward preparing the country for a vaccine with an emergency relief bill before the Christmas holiday. I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
I'm on the floor today to pay tribute to friends and colleagues who will be leaving the Senate at the start of this new Congress. I consider Lamar Alexander, who spoke yesterday, to be a friend and a mentor. He's an institution around here. He's what I would consider an old-school senator in the best way. He not only takes the time to learn the issues, but he also understands how to explain the importance of the policies that we work on up here to the people back home. By embodying the principles of collegiality and bipartisanship, he's accomplished a lot for the people of Tennessee and all Americans. In the Senate, you need 59 other senators to say that's a good idea and to get anything accomplished. And it's critical then to get to know your colleagues, learn about how to work with them constructively to get things done. Lamar Alexander is masterful at that. We've accomplished a lot under his leadership on a lot of important issues. In the interest of time, I'm just going to mention 2 recent examples where I worked with Lamar and watched him make a difference in the lives of all Americans. First, his 21st Century Cures Act that passed back in 2016. It provided needed authorization for investments in the National Institutes of Health and other research institutions to help create new breakthroughs in treatments and cures for cancer, Alzheimer's, other diseases, as well as advancements in developing medical treatments tailored to each person's individual genome. It was groundbreaking work, but it probably got less noticed, but also authorized an unprecedented amount of funding in the state opioid response grants to combat opioid epidemics that have hit almost all of our states. Certainly it's hit Ohio and Tennessee hard. This has served as an absolute essential complement to what's called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, which we had passed earlier that year. Without the 21st Century Cures Act, we would not have made the progress we've achieved in the past few years in turning the tide in this deadly disease, and I've seen it firsthand in my state and around the country. We also could not have accomplished the landmark Restore Our Parks Act without his help. This bill, now law, will help rebuild our national park infrastructure by helping address that backlog, $12 billion now, in maintenance projects. Over 100,000 jobs will be created in the next 5 years through this legislation. Lamar didn't care about getting the credit for this historic bill, by the way, probably the most important bill for conserving lands in 50 years. He just wanted to get it done. And I saw that as he worked tirelessly, both in public and behind the scenes, to ensure we got across the finish line. Jane and I have cherished our time together with you and Honey, Lamar, and we hope those will continue. But here in the Senate, we'll miss your experience, your wisdom, your spirit of bipartisanship, and your perseverance and determination to advance our country's priorities and get things done. Another colleague who has focused on results is Senator Mike Enzi, a true son of Wyoming, who has represented his home state with class in this chamber for nearly a quarter of a century. Mike is someone I've gotten to know and respect over the past decade as we've served together here in the Senate. In his time here on the Hill, Mike has accomplished a lot for Wyoming. As chair of the HELP Committee, he helped lead the way on crucial pension reforms, complicated stuff, but really important, promoted greater access to education and affordable health care, and pushed for improvements to workplace safety, always willing to reach across the aisle. Over the past 3 Congresses, he's embraced his past life as an accountant and used his position as chair of the Senate Budget Committee to push for smarter spending here in Washington. That's a perspective we'll really miss in this time of exploding deficits. I have to say I'm a bit envious of Mike's post-Senate career plans. Yes, he tells me he's going back to Wyoming to spend time with Diana and his wonderful family and spend more time on the rivers of Wyoming with his fly rod. Mike, I hope sometime soon I'll be able to come out to Gillette to join you and Diana so you can show me your favorite fishing spots. Congratulations on a well-deserved retirement. We're saying goodbye to another giant of the Senate this year when Senator Pat Roberts leaves us. I saw Senator Roberts on the floor here a moment ago. I see him now. I view Pat Roberts as the Matt Dillon of the United States Senate. Matt Dillon, for those of you who know who he was a resident of Dodge City, just like Pat. And like Marshall Dillon and the Marine he is proud to be, Pat knows how to lay down the law. But he does it with humor and smiles and a wink. And he does it in a way with that dry Kansas sense of humor that it's very effective. And by the way, he's always looking for Miss Kitty. He's used that combination of toughness and hard work and humor to accomplish a lot here in Congress. Pat's focus has always been on the people of Kansas. And he's done a lot for the people of Kansas, but his work went far beyond Kansas. It turns out he's the only person in America to have chaired the Agriculture Committee, both in the House and in the Senate. His tireless work to pass farm bills over those years to help growers and ranchers has made him a friend to farmers everywhere, even in Ohio. Just as important was his work as chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Some may not recall this, but he's the one who spearheaded the reforms to our intelligence services after 9/11 to avoid another such tragedy. Pat, I hope you and Frankie get a well-deserved retirement, and I look forward to continuing to stay in touch. We are also going to be losing a relatively young and energetic member of our caucus here, who is also an accomplished bipartisan legislator, when Cory Gardner leaves next year. Only a few short years in the Senate here, yet Cory has proven that he knows how to get things done, using his background in the House and his friendships to be effective for Colorado and the country. He's a smart guy. We've worked together on a lot of critical issues to address some of the biggest issues facing our country. Like almost all Coloradans, he loves the outdoors. And his work for conservation in the outdoors is something that I've had an opportunity to work with him on, including the historic Great American Outdoors Act, which was signed into law recently by the President. It includes the Parks Act, but also a passion of his, which was permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a long-sought goal of the conservation and environmental community. Frankly, it could not have been done without Cory's involvement, period. Cory, we're going to miss your sunny disposition. He may be the most optimistic member of the United States Senate, always got a smile on his face, even when things seem bad. He manages to figure out a way for them to look good. And I'll miss working with you on some of these important projects. Wish you the very best as you start the next stage of your career. We're also sad to see Martha McSally go. I appreciated getting to know her over the past couple of years. In a short period of time, she was a passionate advocate for Arizona, member of the Armed Services Committee. She used her own trailblazing path as the first female fighter pilot to fly in combat to advocate for our men and women in uniform. We worked together on bipartisan legislation as an example to end cosmetics animal testing. She was involved in a lot of different issues. We want to thank you for all you've done in the chamber and look forward to stay in touch. Senator Tom Udall has joined us here in the chamber. I call Senator Udall cousin because of his cousin Mark Udall and our friendship. But Tom Udall has now served for 12 years in the United States Senate for the people of New Mexico. I've gotten to know him over that time through our work together on a number of different legislative projects, most around conservation and the environment. We've had a lot of success in that regard. We have been co-chairs of what's called the International Conservation Caucus together. There's legislation called the Tropical Forest Conservation Act, which we've been able to work together on to get reauthorized. This has been incredibly important legislation. Probably the number 3 or 4 source of CO2 emissions in the world is the burning of forests. And this has managed to save many millions of acres from the burning by simply saying to these countries, we'll do a net debt for nature swap with you. If you owe debt to the United States, which, by the way, many are unlikely to ever pay anyway, we'll let you use that in exchange for protecting your forests. And it has been remarkably successful at a time when we seem to have a lot of partisanship and fights around here about global warming and climate change. This is one area where we've been able to find common ground, and that's because Tom has been willing to step up and be a great partner in that. He's also helped me pass legislation that requires that the U.S. Postal Service use its inventory of the Saving Vanishing Species stamps to help protect the rich wildlife and natural resources that we have and protect endangered species. This results in $5-6 million a year going for that effort, and unfortunately, we've had to convince the Postal Service to continue allowing that great source of funding to be there for our vanishing species. But again, Tom has been very helpful in that. Even in these past months, we haven't stopped on our work on environmental issues. Earlier this year, we introduced the Bipartisan Replant Act to help the U.S. Forest Service address the growing reforestation backlog across our country. This is supported by the Trump administration. It's also supported by Tom Udall, and therefore, we're hoping it can get done. He leaves the Senate with a legacy of tirelessly working to protect the natural beauty of his state and our country for future generations, and we wish him well in the future as he and Jill continue to work on those issues together. Finally, our colleague Doug Jones is going to be departing after serving the people of Alabama for the past couple of years. I've gotten to know Doug through our bipartisan efforts, focusing on standing up to unfair trade practices. Our Trade Security Act to reform Section 232, I think, is the right approach to be sure we hold those accountable who are violating our trade laws, but also do it in a way that protects American jobs and strengthens our U.S. economy. I will miss Doug as a bipartisan partner in that effort, and I appreciate him working with us on those trade issues and other things. The Senate is a body really driven by personal relationships between 100 members. Senators Alexander, Enzi, Roberts, Gardner, McSally, Udall, and Jones have been key and valuable members of that 100-person group. And we're going to miss them. They've all served this body well as legislators and as people. They are high character. They are the kind of folks that you want to work with, and they have been effective because of that. They will be missed, and I wish them all well. I yield back my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Okay. They'll put our hands up. All right. Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. Questions on the Waller nomination?
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun.
Yes.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Braun, Burr, Ernst, Gardner, Lankford, Portman, Roberts. Senators voting in the negative. Feinstein, Leahy, Markey, Murray, Reed, Udall, Warren, Whitehouse. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Did he vote? Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Hassan, Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Jones, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Miss Rosen, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Rono, no. Really slow. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Coons, no.
I think where I'm at. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 48, the nays are 47, and the nomination is confirmed. The Senate will be in order.
Okay.
Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Madam President,
The Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Liam P. Hardy of Virginia to be a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Liam P. Hardy of Virginia to be judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
Thank you. Can you tell us how difficult the scene was for your colleagues?
It was a very challenging incident. Luckily, our local fire station is not too far away from here, so we